Wonderful. And so welcome everybody. And so of course, for those that couldn't make it live for this presentation, my name is Korah. I am the coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. And today we're going to be talking about opposition and resistance at the high school level. I presented this morning at the elementary, and I am excited to be doing this for our teens because it is such a common challenge that we have at the high school, and to know how to make sense of it and how to address it. And so the picture says it all. You see this young lady, her facial expression, it can be so alienating at times for us, the adults, when we're confronted with a student that finds themselves in opposition or in resistance. Some of you may have heard me speak before, and so I often go, present in the same fashion where we make sense of the phenomenon first, we unfold it, unpack it, and then after we look at, so now that we've made sense of it, how do we address it more practically? So I will be getting to the practical side, I promise. Please be patient with me. And right now what we're going to do is we're going to make sense of this phenomenon. And so if we look at the analogy of the iceberg, where on the top of the iceberg is typically the behaviors that we see, the ones that are visible. Whether we see a student who's oppositional defiant, there's even a diagnosis for oppositional defiance disorder, to be able to give a label to that phenomenon. Seeing a student who's reactive, non-compliant, disobedient. It's actually strange a little bit to be using this word disobedient, because do we really want students to actually be obedient? I mean, of course we want them to not cause havoc in the classroom, but there's a difference between, them not causing havoc and them being obedient. Talking about a student being argumentative, belligerent, rebellious, obstinate, and stubborn, at a more kind of soft way of being oppositional, being somewhat passive or procrastinating on a situation, and the antisocial behavior and so forth. And of course, oftentimes when students get caught up in that instinct, and we're going to talk about that in a second, there's an impulse to be bad. They're not choosing to be bad intentionally. This is not something that they choose. It's something that happens to them. And so we're going to unpack this and make more sense of it. And so Gordon Neufeld is the one who presents on this material, and the term that he uses for this phenomenon is called counterwill. And so rather than using the word opposition or using the word resistant, the word counterwill is a bit more intuitive, in the sense that the student is countering what they perceive as coercion from the will of the adult. And so this is actually an instinct. We all have this instinct. And before I get into more of the slides, I just want to take a second, for those that are here, to think, sometimes it's harder to make sense of it in somebody else, but to make sense of it in yourself might really help to situate things a little better. And so think about, you're a day at the mall, and thinking about buying a pair of pants or a blouse or whatnot. And you go into a store, and a store that you really like, that usually, it's not difficult for you to find something that you appreciate and you'll buy. But that day you kind of already had in mind what it is that you wanted to look at, and you didn't really want to be bothered in the store. But then there you get this overzealous clerk that comes in and starts making propositions about, clothing they think might look nice on you, and try to convince you to buy certain articles of clothing. And how does that impact you in that moment? Does it give you the desire to want to shop more, or does it actually turn you off? And especially if you've got somebody who's very, very kind of enthusiastic, and they're in your space, and they're pulling out articles of clothing, and it's almost like as if they're trying to even put it onto you, like they're so forceful. And so the way that this impacts us, and even if we went into the mall with the intention of buying something, there's a slight chance that you might actually leave empty-handed because of the way that the clerk behaved. Not because the clerk wasn't polite, not because the clerk wasn't nice, or helpful, or that their recommendations weren't good recommendations, but simply because their will to try to make you to buy something was stronger than your own will to want to buy something. And oh my goodness, does this create such a pushback in the adults and in kids, of course, as well, in adolescents and children. And so, I think it's important for us to make sense of it in ourselves as well. I'll give you a second example just to really, really, illustrate it properly. Think about, we're Friday today. Let's say, it's been a couple of days, you haven't had the chance to do your dishes at home, and you're going to come home now after a whole week of work, really tired, and you're kind of trying to convince yourself to do your dishes, saying to yourself, I'm starting to run out of dishes in the cupboard. Maybe, now it's time to do that. And then your spouse comes around and has a snarky comment about the fact that, it's your turn to do the dishes, and you've been procrastinating. Um, and so is that going to give you the motivation to do it more? And the answer is oftentimes, more often than not, no. And so this is what counterwill is. Counterwill, although we can pick up a relationship with it, I mean, we're able to tell ourselves as adults, my spouse is pissing me off right now, and I really don't want to do it, but you know what? I might as well do it anyway because I'm running out of dishes. And so we might be able to pick up a relationship with our instinct and convince ourselves to go about and do it regardless. But our adolescents and children don't necessarily have the same maturity we do, and get caught up in these situations. And then the instinct takes all the space. Now, um, just to kind of give it more of a descriptor, a definition. And so counterwill is the instinct to oppose and resist. It is pushing back against the will of others. So the word counterwill, we are countering the will of others. It is a defensive reaction to perceived control and coercion. And I emphasize the word perceived. And so if we go back to the example of the spouse that asked about the dishes, maybe we saw it as a snarky comment, but really the spouse wasn't trying to be snarky at all. Maybe the spouse was just trying to remind. And because we were feeling bad about the fact that we've been procrastinating for so long, that the comment came across as snarky. And so the way that we may perceive the other person's will may feel like it is coercive and controlling, and this is enough to give us the want to push back. Now, the word counterwill, the word will is something that I would like to unpack for a second with you guys. What do we mean by will? What are we countering exactly when we're talking about countering the will of others? And so the will of others is a combination of the following: the person's values and goals, the person's designs and purposes in life, their intentions, their initiatives, their preferences and priorities, judgments and opinions, expectations and hope, plans and decisions, wants and wishes. All of these together are the combination of these different elements create our will. And so we each have our own will, and in order to develop that will, we need to have the right conditions around. And so someone who is living adversity on a daily basis and under stress and in survival mode will not have energy to put towards growth. And developing your sense of self, developing your will comes along with that, to be able to develop that will. And so oftentimes our adolescents that have gone through trauma, or that are hypersensitive and that their world is overwhelming on a regular basis, the energy more often than not goes towards managing their world more than growth. And so those are the kids with whom, the students with whom they have a harder time developing their own will. And because they don't have their own will, it feels more coercive and controlling to be exposed to somebody else's will. Um, and so I want to talk about the purpose of counterwill because there is a purpose. It's there for a reason. But before I get to that, I wanted to continue unpacking a little bit the ideas around counterwill. Deborah McManara, who is a faculty member at the Neufeld Institute, who also wrote the book Rest, Play, Grow, she, in one of her articles that talked about counterwill, kind of explained a little bit how the fact that this will or the counterwill that comes from the lack of will is not something that is a learned response. It is not something that an individual will take on because they are surrounded by others that don't display proper reactions vis-a-vis coercion and pressure. It's not about that we didn't teach them properly or that we didn't put together the right consequences in order to shape them into being better behaved. Counterwill is an emotional reaction, an instinctual reaction that we all have, that we're all born with, that plays a critical role in preserving the self and becoming a separate person. And I'll talk more about that in a second in the following slides. But in the meantime, I want to read Deborah's quote. And so she writes, the belief that resistance and opposition must be unlearned. So if we believe that it's something that is learned, a skill to be developed, then we would believe also that it is a situation that can be unlearned, to be resistant and opposition. That doesn't recognize or value the developmental benefits of having one's own mind. And it also fails to appreciate that we need to grow the person out of resistance, not to punish or teach a teen to behave otherwise. And so what she's trying to allude here is that it's not about trying to shape the child or the adolescent to be in the right place. It is about honoring the instinct and to find a way to help them move it along so they can grow out of it. So remember the examples that I gave you as us, the adults, the one in the store and the one about the dishes. It's not that although we are grown up and we're mature and civilized, it's not that we don't have the impulse to want to resist and oppose. In those two examples, we had the impulse to want to oppose or to resist, but we pick up a relationship with that impulse and we're able to convince ourselves out of it. And so it's the same thing with the kids that we work with. It's not about trying to shape them into a certain way. It's about helping them to discover their will and their instinct to oppose. And how can we help them work that through in a way that is more civilized? So why are teens moved by the counter-will instinct? And so first of all, as I might have mentioned already, is that it is indeed a natural instinct that we all have. And it does have an intended purpose. We're all born with this instinct. It is actually quite healthy for a person to display, to some extent, those tendencies to resist and oppose, given the purpose and the nature of that instinct. And we'll get to that in a minute. But where the issue lies is not in the fact that we have or don't have this instinct. It is when a teen becomes stuck in their instinct. Then they may have difficulties with experiencing vulnerable feelings. And so how are they supposed to pick up of a relationship with some of their challenges when they're not feeling their vulnerability? Oftentimes the students that we work with that are very defended don't really have an inner dialogue. They don't really have a relationship with their emotions and their instincts. Oftentimes they're actually quite embarrassed and uncomfortable to be displaying some of this behavior and don't think it's normal. And so they don't have a relationship with them. They think they shouldn't exist. And so that this has an issue in terms of being able to grow up through them if you don't think they should be there in the first place. And then the other thing that has an impact as well when the student is defended is that if they have a hard time trusting the adults that they are living with, sorry, not living with, but are with in the school, if they don't feel taken care of, or they feel like as if the adult is trying to exploit them, even if it's not the case, that could be enough to bring forth counterwill simply through the perception of, am I being taken advantage of? Am I being coerced into something that I don't want to do? So now we're going to look at the two purposes behind this instinct? Why is it that we're born with this? Is this an error in nature? It is not an error in any way, shape, or form. And so the first reason why counterwill exists is because it is there in the service of protecting against outside influence and direction. And so think about our youth. And even, as when they were younger than that. So I spoke to the elementary group this morning. And so at all of these young ages, if children and adolescents were exposed to strangers and followed the direction and influence of strangers, not knowing if the strangers had their best interest in mind, this could actually put them in harm's way. And so nature is done in such a way to protect against that, not counting on the judgment of that person in order to keep them safe. Attachment is needed and necessary in order to help for counterwill to kind of minimize in itself. We are meant to listen only to those to whom we are attached to. And so you will answer to those in your attachment village, and you are meant to oppose and resist those that are not sanctioned within your village. And so I would bring you to think about the relationship that you have with students. Many students that are very shut down, that are disconnected, that are disengaged, that don't trust the adults. It is much harder with those students to avoid resistance and opposition with them because they don't have it in them to follow our lead and to take our cues. In the design in which they're made, they are made to resist until there's that relationship. And we'll talk in a second about what about those students that do have the relationship and why is it that they oppose and resist then. So we'll get to that in a minute. And then the other purpose as to why we have resistance and opposition is because it serves development by preparing the way for separate functioning. And so what we mean by that is that as you're trying to develop your sense of self, trying to figure out your own will. And so going back to the definition of will, as the teen is trying to figure out for themselves, what are their preferences and priorities in life, their values, their hopes and dreams, their opinions about things, their wants and wishes, and so forth. As they're trying to figure this out for themselves, they put around themselves a protective bubble to prevent from outside influence to get too far where it prevents you from being able to discover for yourself what is your own will. And so again, nature is well designed into not just protecting you against strangers that might want your harm, but also to protect you from being able to develop your sense of what we call individuation, becoming your own person. Because if you have constantly the need to please others to the detriment of trying to discover who you are and what your will is, then you will never get to that place. And so you need to have, to some extent, a degree of resistance and opposition to be able to discover what is your own will. And so resisting because of the lack of connection. And so counterwill, as I was mentioning, serves attachment by protecting against outside influence and direction from those not within the parent-sanctioned village of attachment. And I'm using the word parent loosely here. Any caregiver, anybody that the teen is attached to and following their lead and their cues, whomever is within that part of that continuation of that village, this is whether you're in or you're out of that. And I can't help but think, things have changed in our society. Years and years ago, schools were much more localized. Schools were part of the neighborhood. The people who worked in the schools even lived in that same neighborhood. And so oftentimes the school staff were part of that village by default because they were, in the same area and were part of the community. They had a community village. But now things have changed where schools are more and more regional, not local. And so the sense of community and belonging has changed quite a bit. And so the definition of the village has changed as well. And so schools are at a disadvantage now compared to years ago because of the fact that they are no longer part of that small nuclear village of the family of that teen. The other thing that hasn't helped us at all, to no fault of your own, I mean, part of it is due to the system and so forth, is sometimes the disconnect between home and school, where the parents themselves or the caregivers of that teen themselves have gone through negative experiences in their own upbringing and experience with school, which means that they're not very much in support of school in general or of the staff that work within the school. Many adults are in distrust, and they won't keep it subtle. They will share this criticism to their children. And this may have an impact in terms of when they come to school, if they feel that their caregivers or parents are not aligned with you, how can they then be aligned with you, knowing that whose priority in their village is their caregivers? And so at the base, children were designed to be impossible to manage unless sufficiently attached to those in charge. It is the default dynamic in a child that serves to protect them. And this is still true for the adolescent. And so where we're talking about high school right now, you may say to me, Catherine, I understand, if we're talking about a 5-year-old, but we're talking about, adolescents that are 15, 16-year-olds. Why is it that they're still showing resistance and opposition? And so understanding that although this instinct was meant to protect little ones, it is still within us and that it still plays a role at all ages. It is not a question of age, it is a question of design. And so hence the importance of a good parent-teacher-school relationship. And it's also where we run into problems with the use of substitute teachers, because the substitute teacher, especially those that don't see the same students often, they don't ever get to have the opportunity to build a relationship enough with the kids to be able to have this open-ended relationship where counterwill isn't a factor. And so that's why it is more challenging for a substitute teacher or even some of the specialists, thinking about the phys ed teacher or thinking about the drama teacher or the music teacher, the art teacher that don't see the students as often. The less often we see them, the more difficult it is to be able to build that relationship, and then that has an impact on counterwill. And so I mentioned before about, well, if I do indeed have a good relationship with the student, why is it that he or she is still resisting me? And so there could be two explanations to that. The first one is that there is a difference between having a good relationship with the student, getting along, liking the student, and they like us in general, versus them being attuned to your relationship in that moment. And so it begs the question about how much time and energy do high school staff put into engaging students' attachment instincts before they get to the schoolwork. And so when they first come into class, are we saying the second they come in, please sit down and take out your book? Or are we taking the time to greet them as they come in? Do we take the time to maybe do a class meeting where we talk with, not that we do this for hours and hours, and maybe it can only be done a few times a week, but do we take the time to connect with students beyond the academics, to show interest, to show that we want to work with them? It's not that we're doing this because it's part of our job and we have to show that the genuine interest, an authentic kind of dynamic where we're doing this because we like it and we want to do this. And so this changes everything. When the student comes back from lunch and they've hung out with their peers all lunchtime, and that they were, sharing jokes or doing a sport or whatever, and they're oriented towards each other during the break or the lunch period, when they come back to you. And I know in high school it's a bit different from elementary, where elementary the same teacher gets to see them more often, the homeroom teacher. But in high school, there's a lot more kind of a transition from class to class, from subject area to subject area. And so there is a constant need to re-engage the student's attachment instinct in order to get them to be receptive to you, so then you can give them the directive. And so Part of the reason why some teens at times are oppositional or resistant is simply because they are not connected and attuned to you in that moment. The other reason that could play a role in this is other experiences they had in their day that triggered counterwill, but that they couldn't release that the resistance and opposition in that moment for different reasons. Whether it is, first thing in the morning, parents that are rushing them to get to school, they're really annoyed with mom and dad that's, continuously coming back into their bedroom to say, wake up, now it's time to wake up, get dressed, eat, prepare yourself, with this tone, right? This very prescriptive, bossy tone. And they want to tell their parents to F off, but then they know if they do that, depending on the type of parent they have or caregiver they have, what's going to be the reaction? And could they be into harm's way to actually tell them to F off? And so they might swallow that and keep it into themselves. And then, but the problem with that is that, similarly to electricity, when you get triggered by a situation and that brings forth counterwill, if you don't release that instinct, it will wait until a further time to release itself. It will not dissipate on its own if it is not released in that moment. And so, if for whatever reason other things have happened in their day that they got triggered into their counterwill and couldn't address it at that moment, it may re-emerge with you. And so it may have nothing to do with the situation at hand. It might just be that this is the time or place where they're letting it out because they couldn't before. And so I want you to consider the proportion between the adult's will versus the teen's desire. Sorry, I wrote child here. I should have written teen. The teen's desire to comply and to abide by that directive or by that demand. If the adult's command is greater than the student's impulse to comply, chances are this will and that they're not attuned to the adult in the moment, this may bring forth counterwill. If the obligations are grander than the urge to make things work, if the expectations are grander than the desire to please, if the demands are grander than the inclination to defer, if the pressure is grander than the desire to measure up, and if the forcefulness, because now the adult is frustrated, is grander than the desire to be good, in all of these examples, there is a greater chance that there will be counterwill. And so it is an idea for us to be not just attuning students into our relationship, but also to try to pay attention to what is their degree to want to comply in terms of their motivation, their desire, their inclination. Where are they at? And you can pick that up with their body language even, or the way that they're replying back to you. And so if you notice that in that moment your expectation is grander than their desire, there is no way that by upping the ante that this will help you through this situation. The answer here is actually to have less expectation than desire. And so you can go about it two different ways. Either if we go back to the two purposes of attachment, which is one in terms of the relationship and the other one in terms of creating their own will, can we in that moment kind of distract ourselves from the situation at hand, make sure that we are well connected, or that we back off from the situation to kind of remove the pressure, attend to another student in that moment. And sometimes just stepping away for a second can help diffuse the situation, and then we can come back and there's less resistance. But in terms of their will, are we able to help them find their desire and inclination? If there's a math activity that they need to do and that they don't like math very much, it might make it harder than if they're doing a project of some sort that they really like that is within their interests. And of course, we cannot get away from the curriculum, and of course there are things they need to learn and so forth. And so it makes the dance that much trickier. But for us to understand how this works helps us to understand what's going on, and it helps us to be more reflective in the way that we intervene rather than being more reactive. And so I mentioned before that counterwill serves development by preparing the way for separate functioning. And so the first step into finding one's will is to resist and counter the will of others. You cannot find your own if you are allowing for the will of others take over. There is a need to be able to create that separation. I mentioned this earlier with the other group, and I'll mention it here as well. The more a student is immature, the less they have the capacity for perspective and to be able to tolerate having two ideas at once, two opinions at once, to have two judgment at once, two plans at once, and especially if they are different from each other. And so when the adult is trying to expose their will, and that the student is feeling in that moment that their will is different and comes into conflict with the adult's will, and that they're very immature, they cannot handle that, having deferring wills that are kind of against each other. As they will grow up and gain more maturation, they will have more ease around having differences of opinions, and that's okay. Because you could have your opinion and I could have my opinion, and they may not be the same, but it doesn't mean that your opinion is better than mine and that mine is necessarily better than yours, and that both are equally valid. But this requires maturity and perspective to be able to do this. And so with our more immature students, it really hits them differently when there's a difference of opinions. And so let's look at it from this angle in terms of just giving you a visual to, to take it one step further. So the reason why counterwill exists in the second half of the purpose, the one about emergence, about becoming your own person, is that if you haven't developed enough of your sense of self, then the will of others feels like more coercion. It feels like as if we are controlling and pushing them to do something they don't want to do because they don't know what they want. And when there's something from the adults compared to nothing of the student, it feels like there's pressure. But if the student has been able to develop well their sense of self, and they know their own desires and ideas and so forth, then they feel more comfortable having the two side by side, and it doesn't feel threatening for them. And so there isn't as much counterwill happening. And so the idea is not to make them take on our will, is to help them develop their sense of self so they are less triggered by our will. And of course, the opposite is true too, that the smaller their sense of self is, the more they will feel the counter will as threatening and quite present, and the more they will react in terms of the other person's will. And so thinking about whether the expectations of the adults are grander than the initiatives of the student, whether the pressure that we are putting on to complete a task is grander than the purpose the student sees within accomplishing that task, the demands we put on that may be grander than the desire for the student, the have-tos that feel bigger than the want-tos within us, the directives that are grander than the own intentions of the student, and the input is grander than the curiosity. The incentives and rewards, sometimes we'll resort to incentives and rewards to try to coerce and to convince. And if that is grander than the interests, more oftentimes than not, counterwill will arise. And so again, being mindful of this, that our agenda cannot be more explicit and loud and coercive than their own agenda. And so trying to, in the way that we use the language, rather than saying, now it's time for you to do this, you have to do this, trying to see which part of it they want to do. So you give them a sense of choice, and we're focusing on which part they want to do rather than saying you have to do it, changes everything. But if we get caught up in the have-tos and that we get triggered by the counterwill of the teen, then this may become a vicious circle where, on the first hand, if the alienating behavior from the initial counterwill pushes the adults to be triggered by that and to use discipline that creates more separation, makes more defendedness, and then it becomes a vicious circle where if already at the foundation the student was immature, the student was hyperly sensitive, was intense in their emotions, and that didn't help the counterwill. Now if we add on the layer of defendedness, this will make the counterwill that much more difficult to get past and through and beyond. And so the lens that we need to shift here is, rather than looking at the student in a way that there is something wrong with them and that the behavior needs to stop, that we make sense of it as, oh my goodness, how much coercion is this student going through right now or have gone through in their day? And what can I do to be able to help reduce the pressure? And so this way, they will have less of an inclination to resist and oppose, and then we can move on to other things. Ultimately, what we want in order to get past the counterwill is to be able to civilize the impulse of counterwill. And becoming civilized in our impulse is not that we don't have the impulse, is that we may have the thought or the impulse, and yet we're able to have a relationship with it and talk ourselves through and out of it. And so when we're able to feel that impulse and that we're able to have an inner dialogue about it, this helps us to move along. If we are able to be vulnerable enough that we feel the limits and the boundaries, and that we accept the fact that a no is a no. So this is what we call feeling the futility. So if we're able to feel that futility of the situation, then and that we accept it, we will react much less intensely within our impulse to oppose and to resist, just because we're able to be soft enough in our emotions. And in terms of having the tempering element, for those that have taken courses with me in the past, we talk about the adaptation process and we talk about the integrative process, which is part of what the fruit of that is self-regulation. But in order to be able to temper yourself, you need to feel conflicted within your impulse. And so on the one hand, you may want to oppose and resist, but on the other hand, given your alarm and your care and your impulse to be good, the two together that are conflicting now is neutralizing the impulse, and you are filtering it out. And this is what all three together will help you to grow out of counterwill in a very stuck and chronic way. Not that we should never have counterwill. We all have counterwill, and it depends on the day that we're having and how we're feeling and so forth. But there's a difference between having situational opposition and resistance and this becoming part of your everyday. And so ultimately, the behavior, if we go back to the idea of changing the behavior will only change when there's enough maturation that has happened in the brain. And so when we're working with very defended students, even if they're adolescents, even if at their age they should have grown up, yes, they've grown older in age, but it doesn't mean that they've automatically grown up. They need to have the right conditions. And many of the students with whom you work with are at disadvantage because of their life story. And this has an impact in how they're developing. In terms of feeling their emotions, feeling the conflict, feeling the futility of that situation, this makes a difference as to whether or not we can pick up a relationship with our counterwill. Being vulnerable enough, and of course the attachment. And so all of this together are the key elements that need to unfold for behavior to ultimately change. So I promised that we were going to look at the practical side of things. And so now we're at that point in the presentation. And for those, again, that have seen me present before, I use the pyramid of intervention to walk through the practices that adults can use in the building, from best universal practices for the whole group at tier 1 to targeted practices for some students that are struggling, to putting in place tier 3 individualized intensive practices for few that are struggling to the point where they have a hard time managing in the classroom. And so we're going to look at each of the different levels. And so in terms of tier 1, these are interventions that we're using for the whole group. Oftentimes these are led by the teacher in the classroom, or if there are other adults that are there in the room. If it's happening during lunchtime in the cafeteria or in the hallways, and there's people that are the supervising, it would be those adults that would be applying those practices within the transition periods. What is beneficial in universal practices is to apply these in a preventative mode. Because if we wait until the student is oppositional and resistant and no longer receptive, our practices do not have the same impact. And so it is needed and necessary to not wait until there's an incident to apply these. They are meant to be applied regularly on a daily basis, and preferably when the students are available and receptive. And so I wanted to give you a couple examples just to highlight what does that look like counterwill at tier 1. And oftentimes the way that a student will exhibit the signs, the signs are actually quite covert, much more underneath under the radar, much more subtle. And so in the classroom, we may notice a student who is taking their sweet time to finish a task, or that as the adult is telling them they only have a certain amount of time left, all of a sudden they slow down after they've been told to hurry up. And so the passiveness, it's like almost this passiveness, but at this a passive resistance. This is an example of counterwill at tier 1, especially if the student has to do a new task that they're not familiar with, or that it's something they are familiar with, but they know is difficult. More oftentimes than not, we will get resistance and opposition in those students in those situations. We may also see procrastination, where the student may have started the task, but that it takes them forever to finish it. And there's some students like that, they just never get anything finished. And so this can be a form of counterwill. During breaks and transitions, it might be that the students are passively ignoring the adult directives. And so a student that's wearing their hat into the hallway, and the adult says, take off your hat. And it's almost like as if, it's not that they're doing it on purpose, but it's like as if they're pretending they haven't heard the adult. And so this can be a form of counterwill at tier 1. Or we could also see if there are students that are hanging out together in the hallway, and now the bell has rang and it's time to go to class, that students might take again their sweet time to go to class even though the bell has rung. And so this is an example of counterwill at tier 1. And so some strategies to help answer to these situations. First off, in terms of attachment energy, have we engaged the student before we revealed our own will? And so to go back to the example of completing the task or getting students to get back to class, have we taken the time to even make sure the student realizes we're even in their presence? Sometimes we will say things to students further, away from, we're not close in proximity. We're like on the other side of the classroom. They may even have their back to us. We're down the hallway. They don't even know that we're talking to them or to somebody else. And so being careful that we are in their physical proximity, first of all. Second of all, being able to just gently, attuning to them first. Sometimes using their name, sometimes making a joke, sometimes a smile, all of that can help diffuse before then we give the directive. In terms of being careful about the degree in which we impose our will onto others, in the way in which it comes across very coercively, in our tone, in our body language, in the language that we use, all of that can have an impact on getting a student to resist and oppose us. Sometimes backing off and from applying pressure and not trying to force compliance can help kind of diffuse the situation. And as I mentioned this a couple times now, being able to draw the attention on the student's will in order to get them to be motivated to move forward. And so some examples that may, in the concrete, to help reduce the coercion, minimizing the exposure to additional pressure and coercion by relying on the structures and routines to convey the directives. And that also helps to avoid surprises. Sometimes many students don't like things that are unpredictable. And so making things more predictable and utilizing visuals. You've got a visual schedule that we talk in the we instead of I'm telling you to, you do this. And to rely on the structures, this helps. there's nothing more triggering to a student who has counterwill naturally that comes out often than an adult that says, sit down, take out your book, go to page 5. No, this is not, what I was saying. Can you please be quiet? Even if you're saying please, be giving directive after directive after directive from me to you can be much more coercive than going at it indirectly in the we and using structures and routines. And so we do this much more at the elementary level. I think high school students need this just as much. Engaging the students' attachment and receptivity before moving to the task. And so I'd mentioned that already. And also offering an array of support measures to answer to a variety of needs and challenges. If the student doesn't feel supported in other ways in their learning, they don't have the pedagogy hasn't been adapted. They need to have maybe they need to move and they're stuck sitting at a desk all day long, and they hate that just in itself. Those little coercions, they day in, day out, they accumulate, they add with each other. And so by the time that we get to the directive, it can, for some students, push over the edge. And so trying to see, for especially for those students that are more easily in opposition and resistance, how can we set up the physical environment, giving them breaks, giving them time where they can step out of the classroom and maybe go work with another adult or work one-to-one because they can't do it with a group, that really helps to minimize the coercion. In terms of engaging the instincts, sometimes being playful and using humor is something that can really help diffuse the situation. Now, I want to take a second to reiterate and I might have mentioned this already. I'm sorry. It's Friday afternoon and I'm a little tired at this point, but I'm in terms of peers that have spent time with their friends during lunch and recess, lunch and break, sorry, and then they come to class. And in that moment, they have not yet attuned to the adult because they're still chit-chatting with their friends in the hallway as they're coming into class. They are not in that moment in a time or space where they are attuned to the adult. They are attuned to their peers. And so the only way that you can get past this is to make sure that they are engaged with you before you move on with the directive. And so how can we make it fun and engaging before the class starts? And I'm not saying that you guys should be clowns and that all you should be doing is entertaining the kids, but there needs to be a minimum where we are there, not like robots, that we're human and we've got emotions. And so how to be able to cater to that and to engage the students before we move forward. In terms of tier 2 now, the more targeted practices for some students that are somewhat challenging and that require that additional support. Sometimes these measures and accommodations need to be assigned or scheduled for the student because it cannot be something that is done randomly. It needs to be done more systematically for it to be successful and have an impact and be beneficial. At this point, at tier 2, it's not just the teachers that are managing within the classroom. Support staff might get involved with a small group of students to be able to help this along. And keep in mind that when we're at tier 2, it's not that we're stopping tier 1 interventions and moving it to tier 2. We are adding interventions. So we're continuing tier 1 and adding tier 2 to it. And so some examples of counterwill at tier 2 are the following, where there's a bit more overt signs of counterwill. The student may refuse to do the work, especially if the work is something new or that it is something that they know is difficult for them, that they may refuse altogether to even attempt to try, or they may openly refuse to partake in a group activity for different reasons. And so the fact that they're openly refusing and that they're balking is more overt in comparison to the tier 1 situation. During break and transitions, the student might resist to go to a specific class after the bell rang, especially if it is a subject area that they're not that they don't like, or that they don't really get along with that teacher, or that it's a substitute teacher and really, they don't want to be there in that moment, that all of that can create an impact. Or that if they're playing a sports activity during lunch, that a student who tends to be more oppositional and resistant might oppose the rules that have been put in place for that activity in hand. So I invite you to think about, for those students, creating an inventory of their have-tos in a day, thinking about how many have-tos those students are involved within in terms of the classroom and school experience. How many have-tos are they faced with in the learning situation also? And how many have-tos are present or have been present in that student's life? And so when you look at the combination of the have-tos in all these three different categories, oh my goodness, do some of these students live pressure and coercion? And it's not in necessarily purposefully pressure and coercion. It might be through their perception of it, but it's still just as real, like as if adults are purposefully doing this within their system. And so when we're talking about the learning situation, new learning, a learning that is difficult, they don't know what to expect. They may feel inadequate. They don't want to take that risk to look stupid in front of their peers, or that if they do indeed try, and that they start noticing that they're not adequate for that task at hand or that activity, that all of this can provoke counterwill in those students. It might be a good idea for the tier 2 students, especially. I mean, for any student, but with tier 2 and 3 students, to address them privately rather than doing this publicly in front of their peers where they're afraid to lose face in order to protect their dignity. And to not create more power struggles, it might be a good idea to address this privately, to back off of the situation until you can get a better hold. And the way that you back off doesn't mean that you let it seem like as if the student won, that you make it seem like as if you forgot of a task that you need to do. You need to go and attend to another student. Make up a reason. It doesn't really matter. But give yourself an excuse to step away from that situation, to diffuse it, attend to something else, and come back. And sometimes being able to take a step back can help in itself diffuse the situation. Being careful rather than getting caught up in the power struggle, that we try to lead the teen out of the impasse. And so it could be that we suggest for the student to go and take a drink of water, or that we propose that I don't know, if they need to do individual work elsewhere, that you have a colleague with whom they can go and do some work. And we need to be so careful with those students to not make it look like as if we are trying to get rid of them. It really needs to come across in a way that we're noticing the struggle and that we're trying to support them by giving them what they need, and to try to draw attention away from the coercive elements. And so making the adult agenda less explicit. And so again, going back to bluffing, bluffing is our biggest tool when it comes to counterwill. And so if you have a student that is refusing to do a task, you may make the decision that the whole class could be doing something else in that moment, because you recognize that maybe now is not the right time to be doing this, and you have a better idea of something else that might be more effective. And so I want you guys to think about the fact that doing this doesn't mean that the other students in the group think that you have lost your alpha posture, that you are no longer in the lead, that now because the student has resisted and opposed, and that you have shifted in your way of approaching the situation, that the student has won. I want you guys to know that other students are very much aware of that one student who is being resistant and oppositional, and that they are going rogue and have taken a tangent. And that if the adult is shifting the activity at hand, especially if you present it in a certain way, it makes it look like as if the adult is still in charge. So we are changing the circumstances rather than trying to control the student, where if we do that and we continue in the power struggle, and now things have upped the ante and upped the ante to the point where things lose control, now we've shown to the students that we are not in control of the situation. And so it is so vital you cannot control a student who is out of control. You need to back out of that situation as fast as you can. Being careful about our nonverbals. Look at the difference between the teacher at the top and the teacher here at the bottom. Sometimes our facial expressions or our body language speaks volumes, and that in itself can be triggering to the student. And so refraining from using a commanding or prescriptive manner, making our agendas less explicit, refraining from focusing on the shoulds, the musts, and the have tos, and the language that we use. And if things start kind of losing a sense of control, you're starting to skid in that situation, use as little force and leverage as possible, because you're digging yourself a hole if you start going into that direction. It might be that in that, and I would be doing this not in, in front of everybody in the whole class. This is something I would be doing more privately, but to be able to talk to the student about how hard it is at times to have to do things we don't want to do, a certain subject area that we don't like, a certain activity that is hard for us to do, something that we are doing on a daily basis. Think about COVID, where we had to, wash our hands and put the mask and so forth, and how frustrating that was for individuals. To be able to normalize, to validate, if I were in your shoes, I too would not want to do this right now. I get it. I understand you. And so this is so huge to be able to do that, to name it, to normalize it, to accompany them in that, to give them space to be able to handle their instinct so they too don't lose face in front of their peers, to come alongside the counterwill. Sometimes playfulness goes a long way to be able to diffuse the situation, to be able to distract away from the coercive element at hand, to be playful in a way that it helps us to bring the directives across in a less pressure or coercive type of way. And we do this more easily with the little ones, but I know with the high school kids, we can do this in the same way. Focusing on enhancing their emergence, their will, providing a sense of choice, focusing on the teen's will. What is their desire in that situation, their plans in that situation, making room for their initiatives and involvements, soliciting their good intentions where possible. I know that you want to complete the task, and maybe there's a part of it that's really difficult for you. And so how about we focus on this part, not that part right now? And sometimes just letting them know that we believe in them can be enough to diffuse a situation, and place in charge where appropriate and possible, in charge of their schoolwork, in charge of different tools that they might use to help themselves and so forth. They need to be an active participant in their own plan. And so I invite you to think about, what practices do you use in your daily work to make room for the student's own will in terms of allowing for their initiatives and involvement. And this is huge at tier 2. Now we're moving to tier 3. And so looking at the individualized practices at this point, these are few students that are much more challenging, and they require individualized measures, and they benefit better from one-to-one support at that point. Accommodations and adaptations need to be tailored to the student's needs and interest. The student may require an adapted schedule as well. We know that some kids don't do well all day, every day in the classroom. There is no such thing as success being just about being in class to do your learning. We've got different spaces in the school where students can go to learn as well, and that can be considered success for those students. At this point in time, no single adult should be managing a student to this degree by themselves. This can be highly challenging and provoking and exhausting for any single one adult. We need to work at this as a team, to be able to support each other, to be able to relay each other, to be able to reflect on the strategies that we've tried, change the plan, and so forth. Having the administrator involved, support staff involved, outside from the board, consultants and professionals, outside partners even, the parents as well, to be part of that conversation. And again, at tier 3, we're not replacing tier 3 and no longer doing tier 1 and 2. We are doing them above and beyond. And so we're doing tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Here are examples of tier 3. where the behavior at this point that they exhibit is much more frequent and is much more disturbing. And there can be really a variety of different behaviors that originate from multiple different sources. And so in the classroom, it could be an example such as the student who is flat out refusing to follow any type of routine and adult expectations. So railing against the daily routines and adult expectations, interrupting and speaking over others, doesn't willingly respond to adult authority, says things like, "You're not the boss of me. I'm not going to listen to you," and saying things like that. During breaks and transitions, imposing themselves onto others and invading their personal space potentially, disrupting others' activities and projects, especially when they haven't been invited to join in. And so those students that are tier 3 counterwill students that are stuck in their counterwill are much less receptive to being led in general, are highly resistant to direction and guidance from the adults, are often much less endearing to the adults because they push our buttons and they alienate us. They appear to be independent and not needy. And in fact, it's actually quite the opposite, that those kids that are stuck are truly not independent. And yes, they do need us, but because they are being oppositional and resistant, that they are countering our will, it makes it look like as if they are independent and needy, and it couldn't be further away from the truth. They are very difficult to bring to a state of rest and satiation, because it doesn't feel natural to them to trust the adults, to depend on them, to seek for comfort with the adults. And so these are kids that don't rest very much and that aren't often satiated. And the last piece that is so true and essential to know is that consequences and sanctions are highly provocative to these students. And so we need to be careful and when things are upping the ante, not that we shouldn't be putting limits and boundaries, not that if things have gotten so out of control that the student may be suspended for the rest of the day. Sometimes we don't have a choice for safety measures or for the team to get together to come up with a plan. But understanding that consequences and sanctions is not what's going to teach the student to be less oppositional and resistant. This actually might create more resistance because there's more defendedness. And so we need to have all of these elements in mind. Thinking about who is the student I'm dealing with right now? Where are they at in their development? Are they sensitive kids that easily react to their environment? How about stressors and trauma in their life? Are these trauma kids that have gotten through so much coercion in their lives and so they're allergic to it, because they've gone through so much of it? How about their attachment capacity? Are they able to even attach to you, even if you wanted to create that relationship? In terms of the context, in that situation where the resistance and opposition is happening, what are the environmental stressors that might be contributing? What is the current student emotional state and their intensity? And in terms of the defendedness, what degree of defendedness they're at in that moment? How much are they engaged or receptive to us? And the other part of the equation that is just as important, if not more, is in terms of the adult response. And so what is our degree of stress for ourselves? What insight do we have on the student, but also in terms of where we are at in our capacity to manage the situation? Are we being reflective right now, or are we being reactive? And there's nothing wrong with us having our good and bad days as well. We're human. And when we have our limits too. And so to be able to work as a team and to be able to have another adult that can step in can make all the difference. And being careful about our verbal and nonverbal responses. For tier 3 students, it is vital for them to get ongoing daily check-ins. And check-ins not just about, did you do your work and do you have your materials? Check-ins about, how you doing? I'm glad I get to see you today. I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. It is so important that we take the time to show that we are wanting to invest into the student because we care about them. The need to be genuine, the need to show empathy. This is so important to the tier 3 student because if they are defended, how can we make headway and get anywhere if we're never able to get through the wall? And so we need to be able to soften the wall before we can get through. Being careful that if the student needs to leave because things have just gotten, have gotten too far, that we set it up in a way that it doesn't come across like as if we're just kicking them out. The last thing we want to do is say to a student, get out. I don't want to see you right now. You really want to be careful that we're setting it up where we make it look like as if we are doing this for their best interest, and we've set up a space and time for them to go to be able to take a respite. We're going to get a respite. The other kids in the group are going to get a respite, and doing this in a much more subtle way. Some of your high schools may have a nurturing support center or may have an oasis room where support staff work out of. For tier 3 students that are full of counterwill, this space can really, really help make the difference to be able to offer breaks for the student, where they get involved in different activities one-to-one, and help them keep them out of trouble during breaks and lunch. Working on increasing the student's village. And so if the student is just attached to one adult in the building, the problem with that is that then they will only follow that one adult, and then all of the other adults are constantly faced with opposition and resistance. And so to be able to increase that village where that one adult with whom the student has a good rapport with will introduce and bring into the circle the other adults. Now we're increasing the village for that student. And the more that we've got multiple adults that are in that village, not only is it easier to be able to share that load, and to share the weight and to work together as a team, but also if that one adult is absent one day, oh my goodness, will that student create havoc in the school if they have lost their anchor? And so it is so needed and necessary to have multiple anchors to whom the student can respond to. Being careful with our tier 3 highly challenging and alienating behavior, that we do not take counterwill personally. They don't wake up in the morning saying, today I'm going to do this to piss off this adult. This happens to them. They are pushed in their instinct. We need to, and if we know the student is struggling and they often oppose and resist, we shouldn't be surprised by it. They are stuck right now, and so we should anticipate and expect that counterwill will happen, and we will react so differently when we anticipate and expect. We are so much less destabilized when we know that it is coming. Being careful, that we reflect the resistance and opposition as natural and normal, because we all have it. Not using discipline in a way that will create more separation, like consequences, for example, but consequences in a way that are really punitive. I mean, sometimes there's natural consequences of life, and that's okay. Not making the behavior the bottom line. Saying to the student, yeah, today was hard. And to say, you know what, we're going to try again tomorrow. I believe in us. I know that we can do this. I know that we can get through this. We call this bridging, to be able to help the student know that even though they've messed up, even though they've had a terrible day, that it doesn't change that they're a student and that we want to continue to help them. And of course, if there has been damage that was done on either side, whether by the student or us, and I don't mean damage in terms of physical, it could even be certain things we said that we regret that we've said, taking the time to repair that, saying to the student, you know what, yesterday really got out of hand, and I said certain things that I kind of didn't mean. It's not where I wanted it to go. And what's interesting about doing that is that we also model to kids that we too have good and bad days, and how can we go about repairing it when we do have those bad days. And of course, when we are in the middle of that power struggle, oh my goodness, I mean, just look at this young lady in the picture. Just her body language and her gestures can be enough to trigger us. And so to be careful that we don't get sucked into this dynamic, that we may find another time to address it, because now is just, you're not going to go anywhere with the situation. Rather than trying to control the student, looking at changing the circumstances and bridging and repairing the fallout if needed. In terms of our language, language changes everything. And so thinking about how we say things, rather than saying, no, no, you won't, not right now, be quiet. Saying things like, yeah, I understand this is important to you. How about we blah, 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 and then we go on with the situation, or I see that you're really eager to share. This is really important to you, but right now, we're doing this. So later, I promise we'll find a time for this. It changes everything in the way that we address things. And so to conclude on this presentation, our role vis-a-vis counterwill in adolescence ultimately is threefold. It is about adjusting our view around this dynamic, taking it less personally, recognizing it's an instinct, and aiming not to do harm, number one. Number two, that we adjust our stance. And so normalizing the pushback, placing the child, I should have said teen here, sorry, the teen in charge when possible, being patient. We need to be patient with counterwill. And that's the toughest thing. I mean, it's easier said than done. And this is why it's so important to work as a team and making room for the student to display their own will and that they're able to be indulged. And when I say the play mode, I mean through a non-threatening and direct activity where they may have room to display their opposition and resistance. Doing debate might be a great way to get students to speak their mind and to oppose and resist other people's minds. And we're doing this for fun. There's no real repercussions in debate. We're doing this for the pure pleasure. And so if you want to know more, because there is a whole course dedicated to the counterwill instinct, I have resources on the website. I forgot to add here the link for the high school on my main website. And you've got here a picture of it. If you go underneath, I think it is the resources, I can't recall now off by heart, but if you go and take a look here, you will see that there's a section dedicated to high school. And in that section dedicated to high school, I've got articles and resources and materials that you can use to help in terms of supporting the student you're working with. If you want to read more, if you have a copy of the book Reclaiming Our Students, there is a whole chapter dedicated to the child who is resistant. And we have the word child, the adolescent and child or adult, we all have counterwill and we address it in the same way in any of us. And here are a few articles that are addressing adolescents and children with counterwill. Out of the three articles, and I'm sorry, there isn't as many resources for adolescents. This is the main one here from Darlene Denis Frisk, where she talks about the counterwill storm, making sense of adolescent resistance. So I invite you to go and take a look at this article. So I will stop sharing and I will stop the recording.